Zefak-9 sat in his small metal chair and looked at the data pad in his 6 thin fingers. The morning light from the artificial sun came through the window of his office on the Confederation military station. His compound eyes moved across the words on the screen as he read his new assignment. Combat analysis of a new allied species called humans from a planet they called Earth. The insectoid alien had done this kind of work many times before. His job was simple and boring most days. Watch alien species fight in battles. Write reports about how they fought. Send the reports to his commanders who never seemed to read them carefully. The pay was good, and the work kept him safe from the real fighting that happened in space around distant stars. Zefak had studied combat data from over 200 different species during his 15 years of service. The tall blue Valorians with their energy shields that could stop most weapons. The 4-armed hexapods who could fire multiple guns at the same time with perfect aim. The huge Brutons who were strong enough to tear apart metal with their bare hands. Each species had their own way of fighting, but they all followed basic patterns that made sense. This new assignment seemed just like all the others. The humans had joined the war against the Korthak Empire only 6 months ago. The Korthak were brutal fighters who had been attacking Confederation worlds for 20 years. Their black ships appeared without warning and destroyed everything they found. They took prisoners, but no one ever came back to tell what happened to them. Every species in the galaxy feared the Korthak raiders. According to the basic files Zefak read, humans came from a blue and green world far from the main shipping lanes. They had only recently developed faster than light travel. Their technology was simple compared to most Confederation members. They used chemical explosives instead of energy weapons. Their ships were made of basic metal instead of advanced materials. They had no natural armor, no claws, no poison, no telepathic abilities. They seemed like they would be weak allies at best. The transport ship that took Zefak to meet the human fleet was crowded and noisy. Other analysts were being sent to study different human units spread across the war zone. Most of them seemed bored by the assignment. A few complained that studying primitive newcomers was a waste of time when they could be analyzing more dangerous Korthak tactics instead. When Zefak arrived at the human staging area, he was surprised by what he saw. The human ships were smaller than most Confederation vessels, but they were built in a way that looked different. Where other species made their ships smooth and curved, human ships had sharp angles and rough surfaces. They looked like they had been designed by someone who expected to get into fights. The airlock opened and Zefak got his first look at a real human. Commander Jake Peterson was not what the alien had expected. Peterson was tall but not unusually so. His skin was pale pink and looked soft, like it would tear easily. He had brown hair on his head and blue eyes that seemed friendly. When he smiled, Zefak could see small white teeth that looked like they were made for eating plants, not for fighting. Peterson reached out his hand toward Zefak in what the alien recognized as a human greeting gesture. The commander's grip was firm, but not painful. His voice was warm when he spoke, and he seemed genuinely happy to meet the Confederation analyst. The human ship was cleaner inside than Zefak had expected. The corridors were painted white and had good lighting. Everything seemed well organized and maintained. The crew members he passed in the hallways nodded politely to him. A few even said hello in basic Confederation standard language. They did not seem afraid of him, even though his species looked like large insects to most other aliens. Peterson led Zefak to a small room near the ship's bridge where he could set up his recording equipment. The commander explained that his ship, the UCS Intrepid, would be joining a battle group tomorrow to intercept a Korthak raiding fleet that was heading toward a civilian colony. It would be a good chance for Zefak to observe human combat tactics in a real fight. As Peterson talked, other crew members came into the room to meet their visitor. Lieutenant Amy Collins was a young woman with short blonde hair who served as the ship's tactical officer. She seemed smart and asked thoughtful questions about Zefak's homeworld and his work. Sergeant Danny Murphy was a stocky man with gray hair who was in charge of the ship's small group of Marines. He spoke with a rough voice but treated Zefak with polite respect. The humans seemed curious about Zefak's species and asked many questions about his compound eyes and his home planet. They offered him food and drink, though they were not sure what he could safely consume. They showed him pictures of their own homeworld and talked about their families back on Earth. Peterson had a wife named Linda and 2 young children. Collins had a brother who was also serving on another human ship. Murphy had served in many battles and had scars on his arms from old wounds. What struck Zefak most was how calm and relaxed the humans seemed. Tomorrow they would be fighting against the most feared raiders in the galaxy, but they acted like they were preparing for a routine training exercise. They joked with each other and talked about normal things like food and entertainment. None of them seemed worried about the coming battle. That evening, Zefak finished setting up his equipment and reviewed the basic tactical information about the Korthak force they would face. 12 enemy ships against 8 human vessels. The Korthak had better shields, more powerful weapons, and superior numbers. By all standard military analysis, the humans should avoid this fight or call for reinforcements. Instead, Peterson had volunteered his battle group for the mission when the distress call came from the threatened colony. As Zefak prepared to sleep in his assigned quarters, he could hear human voices in the corridor outside. They were singing, something they called songs, and laughing together. It seemed like strange behavior for warriors about to face a dangerous enemy. Every other species he had studied would spend the night before battle in meditation, prayer, or weapons preparation. The humans acted like they were having a party. The alien analyst settled into his sleeping alcove and reviewed his notes from the day. Nothing about the humans seemed particularly impressive or threatening. They appeared to be a friendly species with primitive technology and weak physical capabilities. Tomorrow's battle would probably be routine. He expected to file a standard report within a few days and move on to his next assignment. As he drifted off to sleep, Zefak had no idea that he was about to witness something that would change his understanding of warfare forever. The alarm that woke Zefak from his sleep was loud and urgent. Red lights flashed in his quarters as the ship's computer announced that enemy contacts had been detected. The alien analyst grabbed his recording equipment and hurried toward the observation station that Commander Peterson had prepared for him near the bridge. The human crew was already at their battle stations when Zefak arrived. What surprised him was how quiet and focused they had become. The laughing and singing from the night before was gone. Instead, the humans moved with quick precision and spoke in short, clear sentences. Lieutenant Collins sat at her tactical station with her fingers dancing over the controls as she analyzed the incoming enemy force. Sergeant Murphy checked his weapons and armor while talking quietly into his communication device to the Marines under his command. Through the main view screen, Zefak could see the Korthak fleet approaching. 12 dark ships moved in perfect formation like a pack of hunters stalking prey. Their hulls were black as space itself and covered with weapon ports that glowed with deadly energy. The Korthak vessels were larger than the human ships, and their shields shimmered with power that could deflect most attacks. Commander Peterson stood in the center of the bridge with his arms crossed behind his back. His voice was calm when he gave orders, but Zefak noticed something different in the humans' eyes. They had become hard and cold in a way that made the alien analyst feel uncomfortable. Peterson was no longer the friendly man who had welcomed him aboard. Something inside the human had changed when the enemy appeared. The battle began exactly as Zefak had expected. The Korthak ships spread out and attacked from multiple directions, while the smaller human force tried to maintain formation. The enemy weapons were devastating. Their plasma cannons could punch through most shields, and their torpedo weapons could crack the hull of a ship with a single hit. The humans returned fire with their primitive chemical explosives and basic energy, weapons that seemed weak in comparison. For the first few minutes, everything followed normal patterns. The two forces exchanged long-range fire while maneuvering for better positions. The Korthak had the advantage in firepower and numbers. The humans had better speed and maneuverability. Zefak started his recordings and began taking notes for his standard tactical analysis. Then something went wrong with the human battle plan. A lucky hit from a Korthak plasma cannon damaged the Intrepid's main engines. The ship slowed and began falling behind the rest of the human formation. 2 enemy vessels immediately changed course to attack the crippled ship. Commander Peterson's tactical situation had become hopeless. Any rational commander would order his crew to abandon ship or surrender to avoid unnecessary casualties. Instead, Peterson did something that made no sense at all. He ordered his helmsman to turn the ship directly toward the nearest Korthak vessel and increase speed to maximum. The human commander was planning to ram his damaged ship into the enemy. It was a suicide attack that might damage one enemy vessel, while guaranteeing the destruction of his own ship and crew. What happened next shocked Zefak to his core. When Peterson announced his intention over the ship's communication system, the human crew did not panic or refuse to obey. Instead, they began to sing. It started with just a few voices but quickly spread throughout the ship. The humans were singing what they called battle hymns while preparing to die in a collision with their enemy. Lieutenant Collins worked at her station with new intensity as the ship accelerated toward the Korthak vessel. Instead of becoming less accurate under stress like most species would, her targeting became more precise. She calculated firing solutions for weapons that should have been impossible to aim during such a dangerous maneuver. Her fingers moved across her controls like she was playing music instead of operating military equipment. The enemy ship tried to move away from the approaching human vessel, but Collins had predicted their escape route. Her weapons found weak points in the Korthak shields and exploited them with shots that seemed to come from impossible angles. The alien ship's defensive systems began to fail under the concentrated human attack. At the last moment, Peterson ordered the ship to change course slightly. Instead of ramming the enemy vessel directly, the Intrepid passed close enough to launch boarding pods filled with Marines. Sergeant Murphy led his men into the enemy ship while the two vessels were still exchanging fire at point-blank range. The humans had turned a desperate situation into an offensive action. Zefak watched in horror as Murphy and his Marines fought their way through the Korthak ship. The recording equipment picked up audio from the boarding party's communication devices. The humans were not trying to capture the ship or take prisoners. They were planting explosive charges throughout the enemy vessel with the full knowledge that they might not have time to escape before the charges detonated. The Marines moved through the alien ship like they had been designed for this kind of fighting. They adapted to the enemy ship's layout within minutes and found the most important systems to destroy. When Korthak defenders tried to stop them, the humans used weapons and tactics that their enemies had never seen before. They fought in ways that seemed to ignore their own safety, while maximizing damage to their opponents. Murphy himself was wounded in the fighting, but continued to lead his men deeper into the enemy ship. When his rifle was damaged, he picked up a piece of broken metal and used it as a club. When a Korthak warrior tried to overwhelm him with superior strength, Murphy used the enemy's own momentum to throw him into an electrical panel. The human Marine fought like violence was his natural state of being. The other human ships in the battle group had seen what the Intrepid was doing and began to copy Peterson's tactics. They stopped fighting defensively and started taking risks that should have gotten them all killed. Human vessels charged straight at enemy ships that were larger and more powerful. Instead of trying to avoid damage, they seemed to be seeking out the most dangerous possible engagements. The Korthak fleet began to show signs of confusion. They had fought hundreds of battles against dozens of different species, but they had never encountered an enemy that became more aggressive when faced with superior odds. The alien raiders were used to opponents who became cautious when outgunned. The humans were doing the opposite, and it was working. One by one, the enemy ships began to withdraw from the battle, not because they were taking heavy casualties, but because the human tactics were completely unpredictable. The Korthak commanders could not calculate what the humans would do next, because the humans seemed willing to sacrifice their own ships to destroy their enemies. It was a level of aggressive behavior that the alien raiders had never encountered. By the time Murphy and his Marines had planted their charges and escaped back to their own ship, half the Korthak fleet was already retreating toward the edge of the star system. The enemy vessels that remained were trying to maintain distance from the human ships while continuing their attacks. They had lost the initiative in a battle where they should have had every advantage. The explosive charges that the Marines had planted detonated just as the Intrepid moved away from the enemy vessel. The Korthak ship broke apart in a series of internal explosions that lit up space like a small star. The other enemy ships immediately began a full retreat, abandoning the attack on the civilian colony they had come to raid. As the human fleet regrouped and counted their casualties, Zefak sat in his observation station trying to process what he had witnessed. The humans had won a battle they should have lost by using tactics that defied every principle of military science he had studied. They had turned their weaknesses into strengths and their desperate situation into an opportunity for victory. Commander. Peterson returned to his normal friendly demeanor as soon as the enemy ships left the area. He checked on his wounded crew members and congratulated his officers on their performance. But Zephyr could not forget the transformation he had seen in the humans' eyes when the battle started. There was something inside these creatures that awakened when they faced violence, something that made them far more dangerous than their peaceful appearance suggested. The alien analyst began to realize that his assignment might not be as routine as he had expected. He had come to study another primitive species with basic fighting abilities. Instead, he had discovered something that challenged his understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. The humans fought like no other species he had ever observed, and that realization filled him with a growing sense of unease. 3 weeks after the first battle, Zephyr found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about military science. The human fleet had engaged Korthak forces 6 more times, and each encounter had revealed new aspects of human behavior that defied conventional wisdom about warfare. The alien analyst's reports were becoming longer and more detailed as he struggled to document tactics that seemed to violate the basic laws of combat strategy. The siege of Kepler Station had been the most disturbing example yet. The mining facility orbited a dead planet on the edge of Confederation space and served as a supply depot for military operations in the sector. When 3 Korthak heavy cruisers attacked the station, the small human garrison should have surrendered immediately. Instead, they had chosen to fight a defensive battle that lasted for 8 days and ended with the complete destruction of the attacking force. Zephyr had watched the entire engagement from a safe observation post on a nearby asteroid. The human defenders were led by Marine Captain Lisa Carter, a small woman with red hair who looked like she would have trouble lifting heavy equipment. The station's chief engineer was Bobby Hayes, a young man who seemed more interested in fixing broken machines than fighting battles. Together with 40 other humans, they had held off an enemy force that outnumbered them 10-1. What made the battle so disturbing was how the humans had adapted to impossible circumstances. When their ammunition ran out after the 3rd day, they did not ask for rescue or attempt to negotiate with their attackers. Instead, Carter organized her Marines to manufacture new weapons from maintenance equipment and spare parts found throughout the station. They turned welding torches into flamethrowers and mining charges into improvised grenades. Hayes had done something even more remarkable. When the station's main power grid was damaged by enemy fire, he had rewired the entire electrical system to create energy weapons that could punch through Korthak armor. The young engineer had no formal weapons training, but he understood machinery well enough to turn a mining facility into a fortress bristling with deadly surprises. By the 6th day of the siege, the Korthak forces were becoming frustrated and careless. They had expected to overwhelm the station quickly and move on to more important targets. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a grinding battle of attrition, with defenders who seemed to become more creative and dangerous as their situation grew more desperate. The humans had turned every corridor into a killing field and every room into a potential trap. They used their knowledge of the station's layout to appear and disappear like ghosts, striking at enemy boarding parties and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. Carter's Marines moved through maintenance, tunnels and air vents to attack from unexpected directions. Hayes rigged doors to explode when opened, and elevators to drop invaders into carefully prepared ambushes. What disturbed Zephyr most was how the humans seemed to thrive under conditions that would break most other species. Instead of becoming exhausted and demoralized, they appeared to draw energy from their desperate situation. They joked with each other between firefights and sang their battle songs while preparing new traps for their enemies. The worse their tactical position became, the more innovative their solutions grew. On the 8th day, Hayes had managed to overload the station's mining laser and turn it into a weapon capable of destroying starships. The beam cut through the hull of the lead Korthak cruiser like it was made of paper. The remaining enemy vessels immediately retreated, abandoning an assault that should have succeeded easily against any other species. The Battle of the Crimson Nebula had been even more revealing. A human patrol fleet had been caught in an ambush by superior Korthak forces while investigating reports of enemy activity in the gas cloud. The nebula's radiation interfered with long-range communications, cutting the human ships off from command and leaving each vessel to fight independently. Zefak had expected the isolated human units to become confused and ineffective without central coordination. Instead, the opposite had happened. Individual squads and ship crews began acting with remarkable precision, as if they were following some invisible battle plan that existed in their genetic memory. Private Joe Sanders, a young Marine with less than 6 months of combat experience, had single-handedly held a crucial corridor aboard his ship for 6 hours, using nothing but improvised explosives and determination that bordered on insanity. Human ships had coordinated their attacks without radio communication, using tactics that seemed to emerge spontaneously from their shared understanding of violence. They moved like a pack of hunters who had worked together for years, anticipating each other's actions and covering weaknesses without being told what to do. It was as if warfare was their natural state, and peace was the artificial condition. During the raid on Vega 7, Zefak had observed human special forces in action for the first time. The team was led by Colonel Kate Morrison, a tall woman with gray eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Her demolitions expert was Rick Torres, a cheerful man who treated explosives like toys and spoke lovingly about the destructive power of different chemical compounds. The team's sniper was Maria Santos, a quiet woman who could put bullets through targets that were barely visible to most species. The mission had been to destroy a Korthak supply depot hidden in an asteroid field. What should have been a simple infiltration and sabotage operation had turned into something far more complex when the humans discovered enemy prisoners being held at the facility. Instead of sticking to their original objectives, Morrison had decided to rescue the captured aliens even though it meant fighting through 10 times as many guards. The change in the humans when they learned about the prisoners had been terrifying to witness. Their casual professionalism had transformed into something cold and purposeful that made Zefak's skin crawl. Morrison's voice had become quiet and deadly when she explained that they would now be operating under what she called enhanced rules of engagement. Torres had begun preparing weapons that were designed not just to kill, but to send a message about what happened to those who harmed innocent creatures. Santos had taken shots that should have been impossible, threading bullets through gaps in enemy armor from distances that challenged the limits of her equipment. But what made her accuracy so disturbing was not the skill involved, but the calm satisfaction she showed each time an enemy fell to her fire. She killed with the same focused attention that other species used for art or music. The humans had not simply completed their mission and rescued the prisoners. They had eliminated every Korthak warrior in the facility with methodical precision that left no survivors to report what had happened. The alien raiders who found the facility later discovered evidence of weapons and tactics they had never seen before, along with messages written in human languages that roughly translated as warnings about the consequences of harming civilians. As Zefak reviewed his recordings from these engagements, he began to notice patterns that disturbed him deeply. The humans possessed an intuitive understanding of violence that other species required years of training to develop. They adapted to new weapons within minutes, developed counter-strategies for enemy tactics on the fly, and most frighteningly, they learned from every encounter to become even more effective killers. What made their behavior so unsettling was how normal they seemed between battles. Peterson still talked about his family back home and showed pictures of his children. Collins still asked thoughtful questions about other species and cultures. Murphy still treated Zefak with polite respect and offered to share his meals. They were friendly, curious, and seemingly peaceful creatures who transformed into perfect warriors the moment violence became necessary. Zefak had studied the combat capabilities of hundreds of species during his career, but he had never encountered anything like humanity. Most aliens were either natural warriors who lived for battle or peaceful creatures who fought only when forced to defend themselves. The humans seemed to exist in both categories simultaneously, switching between states so quickly that it was difficult to believe they were the same individuals. The analysts' reports were growing longer and more detailed with each engagement, filled with observations that challenged everything the Confederation thought it knew about military science. His superiors had begun requesting additional data, fascinated by these unusual allies who seemed capable of winning battles they should have lost. They wanted to understand how human tactics could be adapted for use by other species, but Zefak was beginning to suspect that human warfare could not be copied or taught to other aliens. It seemed to come from something deep in their nature, something that had been shaped by millions of years of evolution on a world where conflict was constant and peace was temporary. They did not fight like civilized beings who had learned military skills, but like forces of nature that had been weaponized by time and experience. As he prepared his next report for transmission to Confederation headquarters, the alien analyst found himself wondering if documenting human combat capabilities was wise. Some knowledge was dangerous to possess, and he was beginning to fear that he was studying something that should have remained hidden from the rest of the galaxy. The liberation of Vortex Prime changed everything Zefak thought he understood about human nature. The prison planet had been one of the Korthak Empire's most heavily guarded facilities, where captured aliens from dozens of species were held, in conditions so brutal that few prisoners survived more than a year. Intelligence reports suggested that over 10,000 civilians were being held there, including children taken during raids on frontier colonies. Zefak had been assigned to observe a human special forces unit that volunteered for the rescue mission. The team was led by Colonel Kate Morrison, a woman in her 40s whose calm demeanor masked something dangerous that lurked just beneath the surface. Her second in command was Major Bill Crawford, a soft-spoken man who had served in more battles than most aliens saw in several lifetimes. The team included demolitions expert Rick Torres, who treated high explosives like a master craftsman working with delicate tools, and sniper Maria Santos, whose quiet intensity made even other humans uncomfortable. The mission briefing had been routine. Infiltrate the prison facility, disable the guards, free the prisoners, and evacuate before Korthak reinforcements could arrive. It was the kind of operation that human special forces had performed successfully dozens of times before. Zefak expected to document another example of human tactical superiority and file a standard report with his superiors. The first sign that something was different came when Morrison reviewed the intelligence data about conditions inside the prison. As she read reports about torture chambers and medical experiments, something shifted in her expression that made Zefak instinctively move farther away from her. The colonel's voice remained steady when she briefed her team, but her eyes had become flat and cold like those of a predator selecting prey. Torres had reacted even more dramatically to the intelligence reports. The cheerful demolitions expert who normally joked about his work became silent and focused as he prepared equipment that Zefak had never seen before. When the alien analyst asked about the unusual weapons, Torres explained in a quiet voice that some situations required tools designed to send messages rather than simply complete objectives. He would not elaborate on what those messages might be. Santos had studied photographs of Korthak guards with an intensity that made Zefak uncomfortable. The sniper traced firing angles on the facility blueprints and calculated ranges with mechanical precision. But there was something personal in her attention to detail that suggested this mission meant more to her than professional duty. When she spoke about the guards, her voice carried a tone that promised consequences beyond simple death. The infiltration of Vortex Prime had proceeded according to plan for the first 3 hours. The human team moved through the facility's outer defenses like shadows, disabling security systems and eliminating sentries with efficiency that bordered on artistry. Morrison coordinated her team's movements with hand signals and whispered commands that demonstrated years of training and experience working together. Everything changed when they reached the first detention block and saw what the Korthak had been doing to their prisoners. Zefak's recording equipment captured images that he would spend years trying to forget. Alien children who had been subjected to medical experiments that served no scientific purpose beyond causing suffering. Adult prisoners who had been tortured, not for information, but for the entertainment of their guards. Bodies stacked in corridors like garbage waiting to be disposed of. The transformation in the human team was immediate and terrifying. Morrison's tactical communications shifted from professional military language to something that sounded more like a religious ceremony. She began using phrases that roughly translated as righteous fury and divine retribution. Crawford acknowledged her orders with responses that suggested they were now operating under rules that had nothing to do with conventional military doctrine. Torres abandoned his carefully planned demolitions and began improvising weapons from materials he found in the facility. But these were not tools designed for maximum tactical effectiveness. They were instruments of psychological warfare meant to communicate the depth of human anger to anyone who might discover them later. He worked with focused intensity while humming melodies that sounded like funeral songs. Santos took up positions that gave her clear views of enemy personnel throughout the facility. Her shots were no longer aimed at quick, clean kills that would minimize noise and confusion. Instead, she began targeting specific body parts that would cause maximum pain and terror, while keeping her victims alive long enough to understand what was happening to them. She worked with the patient attention of an artist creating a masterpiece. What horrified Zefek most was the realization that everything he had witnessed during previous battles had been humans restraining themselves. They had been fighting with honor codes, rules of engagement, and moral considerations that actually limited their combat effectiveness. When those restraints were removed for a cause they considered worthy, the humans became something that defied classification in any military manual. Morrison moved through the facility like a force of nature that had taken human form. She killed, with techniques that seemed designed to inspire maximum fear in anyone who might witness them. Guards who surrendered were not taken prisoner or simply executed. They were subjected to treatment that served as warnings to others about the consequences of harming innocent creatures under human protection. The team's progress through the facility became a methodical extermination that left no enemy survivors. But it was not random violence or uncontrolled rage. It was surgical precision applied with the specific goal of sending a message that would spread throughout the Korthak Empire. The humans wanted their enemies to know exactly what would happen to those who tortured children and civilians. Crawford coordinated the evacuation of prisoners with the same calm efficiency he brought to combat operations. He organized medical treatment for the wounded and arranged transportation for those too weak to walk. But between these acts of mercy, he participated in the systematic elimination of enemy personnel with methods that ensured the facility's discovery would serve as a warning to other Korthak commanders. As the mission neared completion, Torres planted charges throughout the facility that were designed to create specific patterns of destruction. The explosions would leave evidence of advanced human weapons and tactics, while creating symbols that roughly translated as messages about divine justice and the protection of innocence. Future investigators would understand that something terrible had visited this place in response to the crimes committed there. Santos maintained overwatch during the evacuation, but her role had evolved beyond simple sniper support. She was now serving as the team's instrument of final judgment, ensuring that no enemy personnel escaped to report what they had witnessed. Her accuracy remained perfect, but her methods had become demonstrations of human capability that would haunt the dreams of any Korthak who heard descriptions of what happened at Vortex Prime. The rescued prisoners were evacuated successfully, but word of the facility's fate spread through Korthak military channels within days. Reports described evidence of weapons and tactics that their military scientists could not explain, along with symbols and messages that suggested the humans possessed capabilities far beyond what intelligence assessments had indicated. The raid had achieved its tactical objectives while delivering a strategic message about the consequences of certain types of behavior. During the return journey to Confederation space, Zefak observed the human team as they returned to their normal demeanor. Morrison discussed her family back on Earth and showed pictures of her daughter's graduation from university. Crawford talked about his plans to retire and buy a small farm where he could raise animals. Torres shared jokes and funny stories about mishaps during training exercises. Santos read books about art and music while cleaning her rifle with gentle attention. They seemed like completely different people from the warriors who had methodically exterminated an entire enemy facility just hours before. The transformation was so complete that Zefak began to question whether his recordings were accurate. But the equipment did not lie, and the evidence of what these humans could become when properly motivated was documented in terrifying detail. As Zefak prepared his report on the Vortex Prime operation, he realized that his assignment had become something far more serious than routine combat analysis. He was documenting the capabilities of a species that could switch between compassionate protectors and perfect killers with a speed that suggested both states were equally natural to them. The implications of that discovery were too dangerous to contemplate, but too important to ignore. 6 months after beginning his assignment, Zefak sat in his quarters aboard the Confederation flagship and stared at the completed report that would change everything the galaxy thought it knew about humanity. The war with the Korthak Empire was effectively over, not through negotiation or gradual victory, but because word of human combat capabilities had spread through enemy ranks like a plague of terror that destroyed their will to fight. The alien analyst had documented over 30 separate engagements between human forces and Korthak raiders during his time with the fleet. Each battle had revealed new aspects of human warfare that defied conventional military wisdom and challenged basic assumptions about the nature of civilized conflict. His reports had grown from simple tactical summaries into detailed psychological studies of a species that seemed designed by evolution itself to wage war. The final Korthak retreat had begun after news of the Vortex Prime liberation reached their home systems. Enemy commanders who received reports about the prison facility's fate had begun requesting transfers to sectors where they would not encounter human forces. Korthak military leaders were calling humans the demon species, and warning their subordinates that surrender was preferable to capture by creatures who showed no mercy to those who harmed civilians. Within weeks, the entire enemy fleet had withdrawn to their core territories and sued for peace through neutral intermediaries. The Korthak Empire, which had terrorized the galaxy for decades, was begging for terms that would guarantee they would never again face human warriors in battle. Their surrender documents specifically mentioned their fear of creatures who fought, with capabilities that violated known laws of physics and biology. As Zefak reviewed his final notes, he reflected on the transformation he had witnessed in his own understanding of what humans truly were. Commander Peterson still visited him occasionally, bringing updates about the progress of peace negotiations and sharing stories about his family back on Earth. The human officer remained as friendly and thoughtful as he had been during their first meeting, but the alien analyst now knew what lay beneath that gentle exterior. Peterson spoke with genuine warmth about his wife Linda and their 2 children. He showed pictures of family gatherings and talked about his hopes for a peaceful future, where his son and daughter would not have to serve in military forces. He seemed like the kind of person who would rescue injured animals and volunteer to help his neighbors with difficult tasks. But Zefak had watched this same man orchestrate the destruction of enemy fleets with tactics so brutal that surviving Korthak warriors refused to speak about what they had experienced. The contradiction no longer seemed impossible to the alien analyst. During his months of observation, he had learned that humans existed in a state of constant duality between creation and destruction, compassion and violence, civilization and savagery. They were capable of building beautiful art and music while simultaneously developing weapons that could sterilize entire planets. They created complex moral systems that protected the innocent, while establishing military doctrines that could eliminate any threat to those they chose to defend. What made humans so dangerous was not their individual physical capabilities, which were modest compared to many other species. It was their psychological adaptations that had been shaped by millions of years of evolution on a world where peace was temporary and conflict was inevitable. They had developed minds that could switch between states of being with a speed that allowed them to be gentle parents in the morning and perfect killers in the afternoon. Zefak had researched human history during his assignment and discovered that their homeworld had never known true peace. Every generation of humans had fought wars against other humans, developing tactics and technologies that were immediately turned against new enemies when old conflicts ended. They had spent millennia in constant preparation for violence while simultaneously building civilizations based on cooperation and mutual aid. The result was a species that understood warfare on levels that other aliens could barely comprehend. Humans did not learn to fight. They learned to control their natural capacity for violence and direct it toward specific targets. When those controls were removed or bypassed, they became creatures that could adapt to any combat situation and develop solutions that their enemies could not predict or counter. The alien analyst's final report contained detailed tactical analysis of human combat methods, but it also included observations that went far beyond military science. He described a species whose psychology had been forged in constant conflict, whose biology had adapted to survive in environments where death was always present, and whose culture had developed methods for channeling aggression that would have destroyed other civilizations. His recommendations were classified at the highest levels and distributed only to senior Confederation leadership. The primary conclusion was simple and terrifying in its implications. Humans were not just valuable allies in the war against the Korthak Empire. They were the most dangerous predatory species the galaxy had ever encountered. Their capacity for violence was matched only by their ability to restrain that violence when they chose to do so. The report concluded with specific warnings about maintaining the alliance with humanity. The Confederation must never give humans cause to consider other member species as enemies. Treaties and agreements must be honored completely and without question. Any actions that humans might interpret as threats to their civilians or their homeworld must be avoided at all costs, because the consequences would be beyond the ability of any other species to survive. Zefak included psychological profiles of individual humans he had observed, noting their ability to form genuine friendships with aliens while maintaining the capacity to eliminate entire enemy populations when they judged such action to be necessary. He documented their moral flexibility that allowed them to be compassionate protectors and merciless destroyers depending on the circumstances they faced. The most disturbing section of his report dealt with human reproduction and population growth. Unlike most advanced species, humans continued to produce large numbers of offspring and showed no signs of the declining birth rates that typically accompanied technological development. Every human generation was larger than the one before it, and each new group of humans inherited the same psychological adaptations that made their parents such effective warriors. Within a few centuries, human population would exceed that of most other Confederation species combined. If they ever decided that the galaxy belonged to them, no combination of alien forces would be able to stop them from taking whatever they wanted. The only thing preventing human expansion was their own moral systems, which could change if they perceived threats to their survival or their values. As Zefak sealed his final report and prepared it for transmission to Confederation headquarters, he included a personal recommendation that he be granted extended psychiatric treatment following the completion of his assignment. The months of observing human combat capabilities had left him with knowledge that was too dangerous to carry without professional support. His final log entry summarized everything he had learned in language that he hoped would convey the urgency of his warnings. He had been ordered to record human combat capabilities and analyze their potential as military allies. He had completed that assignment, but in the process he had discovered something that challenged the fundamental assumptions about civilization and warfare that governed galactic society. Humans were not civilized beings who had learned to fight when necessary. They were weapons that had learned to pretend to be civilized when it served their purposes. They fought not like advanced aliens who used technology to overcome natural limitations, but like forces of nature that had been given intelligence and moral purpose. They were evolution's perfect answer to the question of how to create creatures capable of surviving in a universe where violence was always possible. The alien analyst concluded his report with a prayer to whatever powers governed the cosmos, that humanity would continue to consider the Confederation as friends and allies, because he had seen what humans did to their enemies, and he knew that no species in the galaxy possessed the capabilities necessary to survive a war against creatures who treated impossible odds as opportunities for greater violence. As Zefak transmitted his final report and requested transport back to his homeworld, he carried with him the knowledge that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He had been privileged to witness the true nature of humanity, and that privilege came with the terrible responsibility of warning others about what they had welcomed into their civilization. The humans were not just another member species of the Confederation. They were the apex predators of the galaxy, and everyone else was living at their mercy whether they realized it or not.